Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Anybody who's standing should please feel free to come and sit down. Wow, thanks for being here, all of you. This is the first time I think I've read with a tree in the room, but hopefully not the last. I am going to tell you just a little bit about the book and then read a little bit from it. But before I do that, I just want to thank Skylight Books, which is just a force for good in independent bookselling. And every time you walk in here, you just feel this wonderful energy emanating from not just the books themselves, but the people who work here, because their mission is supporting something really essential to our culture. So thanks, Skylight. And thanks, Sarah, for hanging out with me and talking to me tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Sarah and I have actually been talking about this book for like the last 10 years.
Right?
And so, in fact, what we're going to do here tonight is kind of just continue a long-standing conversation, which should be really fun.
She hasn't answered any of my questions yet.
So The Flight Portfolio is a novel about a real person, Varian Fry, who was a New York journalist who went to Marseille in 1940 to try to save writers and artists who'd been blacklisted by the Gestapo. I'm not going to tell you too much about his story now, because we're going to talk a lot about it, and what I'm going to read to you will illuminate some of it. But he ended up having marvelous success at his work. And so this novel recounts some of the difficulties that he faced and tells us a little bit about the people he saved and what it was like to be in Marseille at that time. And it also creates a fictional sideline to his real story, which is another thing that Sarah and I will talk a little bit more about. What I'm going to read to you is the first chapter. It's a brief chapter. It's from a section called "Despise What Is Not Courage," which is a line from E.E. Cummings' poem. I wish I could lay claim to it myself, but it's not mine. And the chapter is called Gordes, which is a place name from the south of France. There was, as it turned out, no train to the village where the Chagalls lived, one of many complications he'd failed to anticipate. He had to pay a boy with a motorbike to run him up from the station at Cavaillon, 10 miles at a brain-shaking pace along a narrow, rutted road. On either side rose ochre hills striated with grapevines and lavender and olive trees, overhead a blinding white-veined sky. The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. I kept that word, by the way.
Yeah. You made that word up, didn't you?
I misused it. All right, we'll talk about it.
Misused it.
We
Yeah.
have to talk a little bit.
This is going to be very informal.
So Sarah, like I would often text her in the middle of the night while I was revising something and say things like, well, what do you think about my use of that word? And sometimes she would say, oh, no, that's absurd. You can't put that word in there. And other times she would say, yeah, okay. Or she would say, actually, what you mean is conundrum. That's what you really mean.
Did I do conundrum?
Yeah, I think you did conundrum. Anyways, we can talk about excellent.
I should start over. I'm kidding. Okay.
The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. At the foot of the village, the boy parked in a shadow, accepted Varian's francs, and tore off into the distance before Varian could arrange a ride back. The streets of Gordes, carved into a sun-struck limestone hill above the Luberon Valley, offered little in the way of shade. He would have given anything to be back in Marseille with a glass of imperiled before him, watching sailors and girls, gangsters and spice vendors parading the Canebière. The Chagalls had only agreed to see him on the basis that he not bring up the prospect of their emigration. But what other subject was there? The Nazis had taken Paris months ago. They were burning books in the streets of Alsace. They could send any refugee over the border at will. At least the Chagalls had agreed. That was something. But as he reached the house, an ancient Catholic girls' school on the Rue de la Fontaine Basse, he found himself fighting the urge to flee. His credentials, if anyone examined them, amounted to a fanatic's knowledge of European history, a desire to get out from behind his desk in New York, and a deep frustration with his isolationist nation. And yet, this was his job. He had volunteered for it. What was more, he believed he could do it. He raised his hand and knocked. An eye appeared in the brass circlet of the peephole, and a girl in a striped apron opened the door. She listened, strangling her index finger with one dark curl as he stated his name and mission. Then she ushered him down a corridor and out into a courtyard where a stone path led to a triangle of shade. There, at a bare wooden table, Chagall and his wife sat at lunch, the painter in his smock, his hair swept back from his forehead in silver waves, Bella in a close-fitting black dress, too hot for the day. "Ah, Monsieur Fry," Chagall said, rising to meet him. The painter's eyes were large and uncommonly sharp, his expression one of bemusement. "You've come, after all. I thought you might. You won't forget our agreement, will you?" "All I want is your company for an hour." "You're lying, of course, but you lie charmingly." They sat together at the table, Bella on Varian's left, the painter to his right. He, Varian Fry, sitting down with the Chagalls, with Chagall, author of those color-saturated visions, those buoyant bridal couples and intelligent-eyed goats he'd seen in hushed rooms at the Museum of Modern Art. Bella filled a plate with brown hard-crusted miche, soft cheese, sardines crackling with salt. She handed it across the table, assessing Varian in silence. "Had you been here a few days ago, we would have had tomatoes," Chagall said. "A farmer brings them up to the market on Thursdays. I'm sorry we don't have more to offer. The bread's a little hard on the tooth, I'm afraid, but c'est la guerre." "This is lavish," Varian said. "You're too kind." "Not at all. We like to share what we have." He gestured around him at the bare yellow stones, the rough benches, the shock of gold-green hillside visible through an archway in the wall. "As you see, we're living a quiet and retired life in our little dacha. No one will bother us here at Gordes." "You have a studio," Varian said. "You're still producing work. That's what makes you dangerous." "Our daughter says the same," Bella said. "She's been saying it for months. But you understand, Monsieur Fry, my husband's reputation will protect him. Vichy wouldn't dare touch us." "With respect, Madame Chagall, I don't believe that for a moment. Vichy is subject to the Nazis' whims, and we all know what they're capable of. I've seen it myself. I was in Berlin in '35, sent by the magazine I worked for. My last night in town, there was a riot on the Kurfürstendamm. The things I saw, men pulled from their shops and beaten in the streets, an old man stabbed through the hand at a cafe table, boys dragging a woman by her hair." "These things happened in Germany," Chagall said, his tone harder now. "They won't happen here, not to us." "Let me speak to my friend at the consulate," Varian said. "Ask him to start a file for you at least. If you do decide to leave, it might take months." Chagall shook his head. "My apologies, Monsieur Fry. I'm sorry you had to come all this way in vain. But perhaps you'd like to have a look at the studio before you go. If you've finished, that is." Varian couldn't speak. He could scarcely believe that a person of Chagall's intelligence, a person of his experience, could fail to see what he himself saw so clearly. Chagall rose and crossed the courtyard to a set of 10-foot-high blue doors, and Varian got to his feet. He nodded his thanks to Bella, then followed Chagall across the broken paving stones. Beyond the blue doors was a long, high-ceilinged room with a wall of windows, the former refectory of the girls' school. Canvases lay about everywhere, and for long minutes Varian walked among them in silence. As well as he knew the painter's work, he had never seen it like this, in its pupal state, damp and mutable, smelling of turpentine, raw wood, wet clay. From the canvases rose ghost-like images, a grave-eyed Madonna hovering above a shadowed town, serenaded by cows and angels, crucified Christ wrapped in a prayer shawl, his head encircled by grieving sages, a woman kneeling beside a river, pressing a baby to her chest, clusters of red and white flowers rising like flames. It's no small matter to cross an ocean, Chagall said. More can be lost than canvas and paint. An artist must bear witness, Monsieur Fry. He cannot turn away even if he wishes to. An artist can't bear witness if he's dead. The painter removed his hat and set it on his knee. The Emergency Rescue Committee mustn't concern itself further with our welfare, he said. Save your resources for those who truly need help. Max Ernst, for example. He's rumored to be in a concentration camp at Gordes. Or Jacques Lipschitz, my friend from Montparnasse. Who knows where he's fled to now? Or Lev Zilberman, who painted those massive murals in Berlin. Yes, I know Zilberman's work. Alfred Barr fought to get him on our list. You're not entirely on the wrong path, then. Help Ernst. Help Zilberman. Not me. And he turned away from Varian, toward his canvases, toward the brushes and knives, the wooden boxes cluttered with crushed tubes of paint. I'll mention your name among our circles, he said. I know plenty who are eager to leave. Varian stumbled along the road toward Cavaillon, down the hill he'd seen through the courtyard arch. It would take him 2 hours to reach the station at this rate, another 2 on the train after that, and then he'd be back in Marseille, having made no progress at all. And what would he report to his colleagues in New York? To Paul Hagen, who directed the Emergency Rescue Committee, or to Frank Kingdon, its chair? That summer when he and Paul and Ingrid Warburg and Alfred Barr and the others had compiled their list, 200 artists, writers, and intellectuals who'd been blacklisted by the Gestapo and had no way out of France. They hadn't imagined that their clients might resist being helped, nor that they'd consider themselves beyond Vichy's reach. There were so many things they hadn't considered. His life in France had become a process of discovering them, often to his embarrassment. It was a miracle he managed to get anyone out at all. There had been only 12 so far, a minuscule fraction of his list. What he ought to do, he thought, as he kicked stones along the rutted road, was to write his wife that night to say he was coming home. He'd confess, and what a relief it would be that his work wasn't going as planned. How had he imagined it would take a month, 1 month, to find and extract 200 endangered artists? He'd envisioned himself riding a rented bicycle through the countryside, rounding up refugees by the dozen as if they'd be waiting in the lemon orchards with traveling papers in hand. He'd imagined that the consulate would contort itself miraculously to help him. But then, the chaos of this place, the innumerable bureaucratic barriers, the cretins in the U.S. visa office, the resistance of the artists themselves. What a mistake he'd made crawling out from behind his desk at the publishing house. How could he have presumed to take the lives of men like Chagall and Ernst into his hands when he had no idea how to manage them? No idea even of how to convince them they were in danger. Eileen wanted him home. She feared for his life. Her letter from last week had made that clear. Well, home he'd go. He'd write her at once. He'd write her as soon as he reached the Splendide. I'll stop there.
That was exquisite.
I'm just going to take this
And-
out of here. 'Cause
okay.
It's weird to feels weird to leave.
Reading that for the first time, it reads like you're setting up the plot, but you're doing something else, which is you're setting up the essential moral quandary that Varian has to grapple with on every page of this book, which is his project morally defensible? Is it morally defensible to go and cherry pick people to save while, leaving lots of other people? And this is something that you don't forget until the last page of this book, because all of the characters somehow have their own nuanced way of handling that problem. Many of them have a lot of certainty. Varian has a lot of certainty. He's pretty sure that what he's doing is right. And he's challenged throughout the book by minor characters. One of my favorite parts of the book was his run-in with somebody who worked for the ship on which he was going to hide a couple of people, and he had to choose between two artists, and he chose one, and it turned out that it wasn't the one that he thinks that he should have put on the ship. And then this character says, well, what's the problem? Are you worried that you've just put an ordinary person, that you just saved an ordinary person? And Varian kind of brushes it off, but it's just indelible. And I guess my question is that, working on this book for as long as you did, doing all the research that you did you find your attitude or understanding or relationship to this problem changing? And yeah.
Well, as a writer, I had a bias. Like, oh, so he's going to save the writers and artists. Good job, Varian Fry. No, I mean, to address your question seriously, I do feel like one of the things that compelled me when I read Varian Fry's memoir, which I did before I, started writing the book, was that his thinking on the subject changed. It felt to me like that was one of the reasons I wanted to address him in the novel form, because his vision became complicated by his experience. It changed over the course of his 13 months in Marseille, and I'm fascinated by that idea as a writer. How does a person's sense of mission have to evolve when the actual on the ground experience interrupts that initial idea? And I think that I was interested in this as well because in the last book I wrote, The Invisible Bridge, which took place also during the Second World War and involved Hungarian forced labor camps, one idea that I kept coming back to was the randomness of it all, just how people's lives were saved thanks to chance occurrences, and how there was no privileging of virtue or of talent or of beauty or of strength or anything else. It was really, people were really at the mercy of factors entirely beyond their control. And it struck me that in a situation like this, where an organization, the Emergency Rescue Committee, approached the situation as if they did have control, as if they really could make a clear moral decision about whom to save. What was revealed to them by the actual situation on the ground was that they couldn't exercise that control because in fact, it was impossible to defend their position. Yeah, so that was, I think it was the moral complexity of that situation that was one of the chief drivers of my desire to write this book.
I want to ask you about research. If you don't mind, I'd like to quote you from a recent interview.
Why is that so funny, Holly?
Well,
our whole friendship is totally meta.
Okay.
It's just, that's where we live.
All right, silence. I imagine that writing a novel that requires a lot of research draws the one annoying question that a serial writer of autobiographical books also draws, which is, well, like, if it's real, then you didn't really craft anything, you didn't really make anything up. And you had a wonderful answer to that. And you basically just trounce this false assumption so beautifully. So Julie answers this. Well, I had to understand the historical record fully before I could craft a narrative in the apertures between the facts. I realized that if I tried to include everything I'd learned, there was no way I was ever going to finish the book. At that point, what I needed was a kind of inner quiet and openness from which my own narrative could emerge. And I wonder if you can just talk about like how that feels to do? Like, at what point did you recognize you had completely metabolized the history and were able to not just, make a rote document it?
Well, I think in a sense, from the very beginning, I knew that there had to be a fictional sideline to this story, because part of what I wanted to explore was the way personal factors would complicate the professional decisions that Varian Fry had to make in this situation. And we don't have perfect knowledge of what his personal situation was in Marseille for a variety of reasons. And so the crafting of fiction in this book had so much to do with what couldn't have been known. So there was a lot of opportunity for that. But I think that, because I was writing about this real person, I also felt this really heavy weight of responsibility toward what was known. And I felt like I had to capture his actual experience, at least the facts of his actual experience, in order for the novel to be honest in a way. One question that a number of people have asked me in recent days as I've been talking about the book, I was going to say in recent weeks, but in fact the book was published a week ago. It just seems like that. Did I have to ask permission of Varian Fry's family in order to be able to write this book? And how did I feel a sense of permission to write about this real person whose heirs still live in the world? And, the answer to that question all along was that I had to be absolutely faithful to what was known about him and what was known about his experience. That the way to do honor to him was to record in this work of fiction the actual facts. But the privilege of the novelist is to invent in the midst of all of that. And I exercised that privilege lavishly in this book because there were other elements of his experience that I wanted to explore.
Yeah. There's been some debate about your handling of the historical record, some documentation of which is coming out in the New York Times Book Review this weekend. I wonder if you could just kind of gloss that recent series of events for us.
Sure. So this novel explores, in addition to the rescue work Varian Fry was doing, a relationship with somebody who he knew from Harvard, who reappears in Marseille, reappears in his life after a 12-year absence. And this is somebody who he had a close and passionate relationship with while he was a college student. And in the course of their renewed friendship, they become very close again, and they realize that they are necessary to each other's lives. This came out of research that I did so many years ago, in the course of which I learned that Varian Fry had had relationships with men while he was at Harvard, and subsequent to that while he was in Marseille. There's a marvelous biography of Lincoln Kirstein by Martin Duberman, in which he writes about Varian's relationship with Lincoln during the time that they were working on the literary magazine they started, The Hound and Horn, which is kind of a renegade magazine at Harvard. They were publishing, T.S. Eliot and Juna Barnes and all sorts of fabulous writers who were, at that time out of the mainstream. And they had a kind of fiery relationship that crashed and burned at a certain point. And Duberman writes about it quite eloquently in his biography. And then in a recent memoir by Stéphane Hessel, the French diplomat whose writings gave rise to the Occupy movement, he chronicles the time that he spent in Marseille during the time Varian Fry was there. They had a very close relationship. They were both married at the time. Hessel's wife was in France. Varian's wife was back in New York. But Varian and Stéphane would escape on the weekends to the small towns in the south of France and kind of explore the countryside and go swimming and go hiking. And they had a romantic relationship during that time. And so I felt that in order to capture this historical figure accurately, I needed to be accurate to that element of his character as well. And so I wrote about this fictional relationship because I felt that probably, he did have other relationships with men that wouldn't have been recorded, and that as a fiction writer, I had a kind of ability to explore what the historical record couldn't have captured. So in recent weeks, some reviewers have raised, I wouldn't say they raised the question. They didn't raise the question. What they said quite clearly was, apart from slight hunches and hints, there is no historical evidence of Varian Fry's having been gay. And I was astonished to read that in a couple of different reviews, because the evidence is actually quite accessible. I mean, you can download an ebook in 2 minutes, and there it is on the page. But the interesting thing that happened was that after one review was published, Varian Fry's son wrote to me and said, "I am so outraged that there's a denial of my father's homosexuality." He said, "This is something that I figured out 30 years ago, and I don't see how this should be objectionable in this day and age." I mean, the suggestion was that by inventing this element of Varian Fry's character, I was somehow changing the historical record about the Holocaust in a way that was akin to what Holocaust deniers do. And Varian Fry's son was absolutely was so angered by that suggestion that he felt that he needed to correct the record in print, and so he wrote a letter to the Times, telling the world everything that I've just told you. And what's so fascinating about this is that this is really the first time that somebody who is that close to Varian Fry has said such a thing in no uncertain terms. And so in a strange way, in the weirdest way, a way that I couldn't have imagined possible, a fictional record of this person's life has actually ended up correcting the historical record in a way that
It's just amazing.
that can never be changed now, or denied.
No.
And one of the points I think that Varian Fry's son made that was so important to acknowledge is that, in fact, homosexuals were persecuted during the Holocaust. And to deny that a historical figure who lived at that time was gay is also to commit an injustice to that part of the history.
Absolutely.
So it's been fascinating to watch all this unfold. It was not a reaction that I expected at this particular historical moment.
You've outlined all of that with such grace and equanimity, but from this side of the table, I'm just so happy that you won, because you were right. You were right. And there was, a fairly blatant attempt to contradict this, these 10 years of work, this great book that you've written, and that contradiction is just scuttled in a word. And it's great to correct the historical record too, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I just want to get credit for one thing, which is that in preparing for this event, I read a Henry James novel, and it was really long. I read The Portrait of a Lady because I felt that it might be a good companion piece to thinking and talking about a long novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I really picked the right novel. I hadn't read it before, but it really is a very intimate companion piece to this book that you've written. And I just want to ask one more question before we can open it up to the floor.
Okay.
And that question is about something that I have really never been able to explore in my own work, and that's the ability to exercise restraint. In the sense of enjoying creating hundreds of pages in which suspense is maintained. How do you do that. It's like a very sexy thing to be able to do.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, well, Henry James is good at it too. But there's, there's something there that is very mysterious and beautiful.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I have always enjoyed as a reader is a total immersion in a character's experience. I mean, it's that thing that fiction can do that no other form of art can do, right? It just sort of drops you into the mind and the life of somebody who is not you and allows you to see the world from behind their eyes. And I felt like one of the things that I wanted to capture in this book, as in the last book actually, was the real passage of time. You know, I mean, it shouldn't take you 13 months to read the book, but I did feel like there were so many situations, there was so much inherent suspense in that situation. The situation in France there at the time was that these endangered artists and writers had fled to France from the occupied countries, and then after the French occupation, they'd fled to the south of France. And there they sat, trying to figure out ways to get out. In order to get out, you had to have all the right papers. So the French exit visa, the Spanish entry visa, the Portuguese entry visa, and the United States entry visa. And you also had to have a valid passport or an affidavit in lieu of passport, which was what many stateless people had. And they were all dated, all of those visas and documents, and they all had to be valid at the same time, which was incredibly hard because you never knew when one of them was going to come through. And it was made further difficult by the fact that the United States was not amenable to having scores and scores of degenerate artists and writers entering our shores. And so there was only one guy in the U.S. visa office in Marseille who was sympathetic to Varian Fry's mission, this consular officer named Harry Bingham. And so it was this one person who, at the risk of his professional life, was arguing for and granting these visas to Varian Fry's clients and to a lot of other people who were trying to get out of Marseille at the time. And so these writers and artists were stuck. They were just sitting there waiting, like you've seen in the movie Casablanca. Time was passing. Nobody knew when they were going to get out. There were Nazis in town. Everybody felt threatened. And the threat was very real. People could be hauled off to concentration camps or deported to Germany at any moment. And so in these lives at the time, there was this terrible sense of peril that was connected to the passage of time and the worsening of the political situation. So the suspense in the book, or the sense of, the ongoing questions as to whether or not a particular person was going to survive, were the questions that were on the line at the time. That was what the people who were involved were feeling at the time. So I think in order to capture that experience mimetically, I felt like I needed to recreate that on the page in some way.
Yeah, but you just did such a good job.
Thanks. Well, I mean, there were a lot of interesting things that were happening there at that time. There were a lot of good distractions that allowed for the refugees to pass the time interestingly, and that also allowed for narrative shape to emerge out of what might have otherwise felt like just a protracted period of waiting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does anybody feel moved to ask a question of the author? Yeah, in the back.
Talk a little bit about the intersection between the themes of war and the themes of rescue and all of that, with the sort of overwhelming sense of longing and an unfulfillable longing that's in the book vis-a-vis Grant and Varian's relationship, and how those things intersected in your mind and why.
Yeah, so, Varian and Grant, who is the old friend who becomes his lover, they face this sense of impossibility. the first hurdle is that they have a history to overcome. They both hurt each other in a way that seems almost impossible to heal. And then, of course, there's the fact that they're both men and that it's 1940. And so even if they find a way to reconcile, the world is not going to be amenable to a future that they might envision together. Yeah, I think you're right, Javi, that there was this sense of embattlement that exists in their relationship that was reflected in the world around them. But there was another element of it that I think was ironic in a way, which is that that Varian's clients were struggling to get out of Europe, and he was struggling. He was devoting every ounce of energy in his day, and all of his associates in his endeavor were doing the same, to actually get them their papers and to find them ways out. Because once you had your papers, you still had to figure out how you're going to get over the border or find a ship that could take you to safety. And what happened again and again, to the tune of more than 2,000 clients, was that he found ways for them to get out. He got papers, real and fake, for them. He found places for them on ships they stowed away, or there were legitimate commercial ships that he got them places on. He had people who could conduct them over the Pyrenees on foot, and again they got out. And at the same time, he knew, and I believe this to have been true of his actual experience, not just of the relationship the fictional relationship that I explore in the book. He knew that his own desire for refuge could never be fulfilled in his lifetime, or that was what he felt, that his refugees could actually repatriate and be saved, but that he himself couldn't find any accepting shore. And I think that this is one of the reasons that when you read his biography, when you learn what happened to him after he came home from Marseille, his life kind of fell apart. Not just because of the horrific struggle to convince people in the States of how dire things were over there, but also because I think that while he was in Marseille, he actually tasted a possibility for the kind of relationship, the way of being in relation that he couldn't have as a daily occurrence in his life. And to then have to come back and, be reminded of his continuing sense of otherness, I think was just unbearable.
Thank you. Uh-huh.
I'm always struck that statistically this is borne out by data that most people, some of us wouldn't have had a choice, but most people in this situation would not have taken more of a stance like your protagonist. And most people would have gone along with the system and just not make noise.
Right.
And so it always makes me wonder about these people who are sitting there, trying to figure out whether to get out or not. What character traits would it have taken? Would they have had to have been slightly crazy and slightly paranoid to want to push themselves early out the door? And what overwhelming character trait would it have been with these people who knew they had to escape?
Well, I think by the time a lot of Varian Fry's clients were escaping, the political situation was so clear. France was already occupied. Germany showed no sign of restraint in its military push. And so despite the fact that some of the clients were resistant, I think most of those who were applying for aid, most of those who arrived at Varian Fry's door, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them showing up every day at the offices of the Emergency Rescue Committee in Marseille. I mean, the writing on the wall was very clear at the time. Now, the part of it that is super incredible and remarkable to me was that Fry, this guy who was an editor and a writer, took it upon himself to go to Marseille. So what is it that makes a person do that? What is it that gives somebody the chutzpah to volunteer for that job, having never done any work like that before?
To invent that job in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he just sort of make it up?
Yes, well, there were others who were doing similar work. There were other rescuers in Europe at that time who were serving other populations. But he himself had never done anything like this. And so, but he had always been an iconoclast. He had always been somebody who wasn't content to accept the system as it was. When he was a kid, he went to boarding school, and there were these horrible hazing rituals at boarding school where, kids would be woken up in the night and made to run 20 laps around the track, and then, they would be starved for days, or they would be stuffed with, they would be made to eat, everything on a table. And he protested that. He was, he ended up dropping out of a number of boarding schools because he didn't feel it was right for the underclassmen to be hazed. And then when he was at Harvard, he was constantly protesting practices there that he felt were unjust. And so he'd always kind of had a mind for social justice. But it's one thing to write about it, and it's another thing to actually get out from behind your desk and do it. And one of the things that I came to feel over the course of the 10 plus years of writing this book was that his sense of otherness, his sense of belonging to a persecuted group must have contributed in some way to a sense of empathy that he felt for these people who were persecuted in Europe. Not that there was a strict one-to-one correlation between those things, but you got to have a pretty strong sense of empathy. You got to have a pretty internalized understanding for those people's experience to actually get yourself up and over there and into the way of danger,
Thank you.
Yeah.
About 10 days ago at a writer's block event, I heard Michael Dobbs, the historian, write about a nonfiction book that he just published about Jews of a small town in Germany, Kippenheim.
Uh-huh.
He ended up in Marseille.
Oh, wow.
He's also spent 10 years on that book.
Takes 10 years to write that book.
He talked about Stephen Bingham and just their experiences and I was struck when you talked about the randomness of it all. None of these people were famous, just the opposite.
Right.
But some of them were saved and some of them weren't.
Yeah.
And he also, as a historian, he talked about how he refused to go beyond what he could verify in the historical record. So it's just really interesting. You're talking about the same experiences in the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
With both a nonfiction and a fiction
Yes.
approach, and how you both tell the stories in parallel but different ways. And I just wondered, I guess if your paths ever have crossed yet, or
No.
he's going out and promoting his book.
I have to get his book. It sounds great. I think I would love it.
It's called Unwanted.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm fascinated to read it. I've been hearing a lot about it. The question you ask is one that Sarah and I have actually talked a lot about. What do you render as fiction and what do you render as nonfiction? How have you approached that question in your work? How do you know when you have a story that you want to tell, whether fiction? Sarah's somebody who's written extensively in every genre. She's written poetry, fiction, and nonfiction.
Well, I haven't really written fiction, though.
That McSweeney's book.
No, I call them stories.
Stories are fiction.
Not these.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
this
Might be a conversation for another time, but.
no, but
But well, no. I think the takeaway though is that Julie and I talk about our work and the things we can't figure out in our work constantly, and I often suggest you should write an essay about such and such. It would be marvelous. It would be so good, and you're constantly saying like, no, it's too hard. I can't. And then you're constantly telling me like, just write a novel already. And I'm like, I don't know how to write a novel. It's just. No, but all kidding aside, there's like a particular sensibility that I think makes people capable of making a certain kind of work.
yeah.
Chagall isn't going to take up jewelry making in this book because what his work is like. It's a certain way. I still think you should write more essays though.
And you should write more novels.
I'm working on it.
Me too. Yes. The question of what to render as nonfiction and what to render as fiction. I mean, I just think that what it comes down to for me as a writer is that I like the superpower that fiction gives you, which is to extrapolate from external circumstances into the workings of the human mind, the inner workings of the human mind. I like that a fiction writer is mandated to go into that space and to try to envision what couldn't have been recorded. I enjoy the freedom of that. And yet, in writing about a real person, I took on some constraints. I willingly adopted these constraints. But there's a pleasure in that. There's a pleasure in the restrictions of form. I mean, you know that as a poet, too,
In nonfiction, though, I mean, it's interesting to hear you say, and, with such obvious truth behind it, like you enjoy the freedom of being able to make so many choices.
Yeah.
And that freedom is so unpalatable to me. It's, I mean, that's not an attempt to be, cute or funny, but it's unpalatable to me. It just seems like dimensionless chaos, and I really enjoy the constraint of only writing down what happened, and it's and there it is, and so we get this from you, and and I write short books about things that happened. They're impossible to compare.
Well, we need it all. We need it all. But we're doing the same thing. We're processing human experience through the medium of language.
Yeah, that's
you
true.
and me. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just curious if you would talk a little about your relationship while you were writing this book to the research you did on the Invisible Bridge, and whether that proved to be helpful to you in this, or whether you had to distance yourself from that in some way because the geography and the people were so different, or how they related to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, I felt like when I was researching the Invisible Bridge, I was learning about the larger picture of Europe at that time. I kind of had to teach myself and also study. I mean, I studied when I was teaching at Michigan. I actually took a survey class in, the 20th century in the history department, because I actually, when I was an undergraduate, because I had taken AP history as a high school student, I placed out of history. I wasn't required to take a history class at Cornell in order to graduate. And I didn't. I was interested in literature and in film and in science and in art, and that was what I studied. And so it wasn't until I was an adult, a real adult, not a college adult, that I actually embarked on a study of that history. That history was great preparation for the writing of this book. I did not have as much catching up to do when I was working on this novel. But then there was a very specific personal history that I felt like I needed to become fluent in order to write the novel. So I had access to a couple of really great troves of documents and information for this research. One is this 27-box archive at Columbia, held in the Manuscripts and Rare Books Library, that consists of Varian Fry's papers from Marseille and from the years that followed. So every letter he wrote to anyone here back in the States, the letters he wrote to the State Department, the letters he wrote to his wife, to his parents, to his friends, letters between Varian and the artists who he was trying to save, letters between Varian and the artists who had escaped to the States and what their lives were like in the States. Hundreds of documents capturing the struggle that he faced there, and the decisions that he made and the conditions that he was working under. I used to teach this class on Monday evenings or Monday afternoons at Columbia, and the archive was open late that night. So I'd finish teaching, and then around 4:30 in the afternoon, I'd go over to the archive and spend 3 or 4 hours there just going endlessly through these papers. Another thing that was fabulous was during the time that I was at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, I had access to Varian Fry's student file there. It had just been unsealed before I arrived there. It was unsealed something like 80 years after his graduation. So the right interval had to elapse before that could occur. And so I read his college application essays. I had access to a record of every place he lived at Harvard. I had a research assistant. I had 2 fabulous undergraduate research assistants, one of whom helped me to get in touch with the girls who lived in his old dorm room. So I actually went to his dorm. You know, it's weird to talk about this because as I do, what I realize is that that in doing that research and reading his letters, immersing myself in his papers, and living where he lived, going to Marseille and walking around the streets where he walked and visiting the office where he did his work, in a way, I think as novelists, when we do this kind of research, we are trying to live our subject's life. You know, we're trying to do the opposite of what we say we're trying to do, write about somebody other than ourselves. We're almost trying to live into that person's life in a way, even though that project is impossible. But there is so very much that exists still that can help a researcher to sort of recreate a person's life from this period. And that was an enormous difficulty, but it was also what made the writing of the book possible. It's also what made it take so very long. That and the fact that I had 2 children during the course of the writing of it. But yes, it was different from the process that I undertook to write The Invisible Bridge, because there I could interview family members and others who were around who I had this intimate access to. And in the case of Varian Fry, who was no longer around, I had to look farther afield in a way. There's one associate of his who is still alive. His name is Eustace Rosenberg. He's a professor emeritus at Bard, and he's 97 years old. And I've had the most marvelous conversations with him about what went on in Marseille. But so many of those stories are, no longer accessible to us. Yeah.
I love this book. I almost lost a friend because she came to visit me and I couldn't put the book down. And when she left, she said, "I hope my visit didn't get in the way of you reading your book."
I'm both sorry and delighted to hear that.
The thing, it's so inspiring, not only Varian, but the group of people who collect around him, who save so many lives. But then at the end, you're also heartbroken that he was so thwarted by the State Department
Yeah.
and all the forces back in the United States. And I was a little bereft at the end that once again you're reminded how little the United States did, especially at the start of the war,
Right.
to help millions of people. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, well, when I started writing this book, Obama was just becoming president, and our border policies were different from what they are now. It's never been entirely easy to emigrate to this country, but there have been times when it is significantly easier than it is now. And over the course of writing this book, as I encountered that frustration in my own research, just thinking, oh my God, how could the State Department have put up so many barriers when it was so clear that these people were imperiled? I started to see this happening in our own foreign policy, in our own, government policy toward immigration. And I did not think, as I was writing this book, that I was writing a story that was going to end up being as topical as it is. But in fact, one of the things that I hope will be true is that the book will really illuminate the danger of exclusionary immigration policy and highlight, just what it is that can be lost when policies like that are in place. I mean, I sit here as the beneficiary of a policy of blanket asylum that existed after the Hungarian Revolution. And there's my cousin, Elliot Tibor, who's also here because of that. My mom and his dad both escaped after the Hungarian Revolution by crossing the border, in the company of somebody whose job it was to escort refugees in the middle of the night over these snow-covered fields. And every refugee who made it out was welcome in the States. And certainly there's no way that he and I would exist right now if it weren't for that policy, because our families were directly imperiled in Hungary at that time. So it matters. And what's truly amazing is that this one guy was so outraged by that. This one guy, encountering that resistance in Marseille, was so enraged by what he found that he continued to put his life at risk and stayed for as long as he possibly could until he was really forcibly thrown out of the country. But it really gives you pause when you think about it, when you're sitting on your couch and you think, well, what can I do? I mean, in this case, this one person managed to save more than 2,000 people. So, we read about him and feel called to arms, or that's what I hope.
What do you think? One more question? Are we at the one more question stage? Are you sure? It's Julie Orringer. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, well, there are two great questions in that larger set of questions that I want to try to address separately. The first about how I found the inner quiet. I think part of that, in fact, was actually finding outer quiet. I work at the Brooklyn Writers Space. It's about 10 minutes from my house. It's this marvelous co-working space for poets, nonfiction writers, screenwriters, playwrights, and anyone who has a project that can fit into any category or no category of creative writing. There's a kitchen. There's kind of a lounge area where people can hang out and have lunch and talk to each other. And then there's a big quiet room where there are just carols where writers can come and hole up and sit for the day. Now, I have a tiny locker there. It's about the size of a lunchbox. I can keep like two or three books there. And there was a point at which I realized I could not haul the entire trove of my research to the Brooklyn Writers Space every day. And that was a gift, because in fact it would have been the worst possible thing. The book would never have been finished if I felt like I had to sort of carry the whole weight of that. So eventually I just ended up carrying Varian Fry's memoir. That was it, one book. And also, and kept in my little lunchbox-sized locker, a marvelous biography by Andy Marino called A Quiet American, about his experiences there. And with those two books as kind of signposts, after I had done all the years of research that I had done, I felt like I could stay faithful to the actual events of the experience, but not become so embroiled in trying to chart every single moment. I did do a lot of mapping out. When I was maybe about halfway through the book, I wrote a document in which I listed the actual events that had to take place over the course of the rest of the novel. It was totally daunting to do, because I realized that there were another, few hundred pages that had to be written in order for that to unfold without a sense of disproportion or rush. But those two books were a marvelous guide to everything that I really wanted to be faithful to. All of the helpers who Varian recruited to his organization, people like Miriam Davenport, who had this marvelous background in art history and was helping him identify the artists who needed to be saved, or Mary Jane Gold, who was an American heiress who had thousands and thousands of dollars to donate to the organization, but who also had this marvelous energy and who sat interviewing candidates for aid for hours and hours on end and maintain a kind of lightness of demeanor that kept everybody from just going over a cliff. And Varian's secretary, who had this dogged persistence, and Albert Hirschman, who later became a world-famous economist, who was undaunted by failure and who also relished the black market part of the experience and who made all kinds of wonderful connections. Those people were a finite group of lives that I felt had to be a part of this book. Fortunately, it was a finite group. There was a limit to the number of people who I felt could be in the book. And there are many others whose lives I wish I could have illuminated, who are connected with this organization in one way or another. But the great thing about it is that this is not the only document that exists about that time and place. There are a number of biographies. In the acknowledgments at the end of this book, there's basically a bibliography of a marvelous wealth of historical documentation of this time. And I encourage everybody to check it out because it's truly amazing. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Sarah. This is great.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.